right, so we're so excited to welcome you to week 6 with our wonderful guest, Mecca Jamilah Sullivan, who's going to be talking about, come on. I know. We're in the throes of it, but you know I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be here with all of you. I can feel all the vibes. I know it's okay. But we're so thankful that you're here with us here week 6.
Yeah, I mean midterms and whatnot, but you're still here. For seniors, shout out. This is like countdown. We're almost there. Can we give a shout out to seniors who are almost there? All right, I love it. I'm here for this energy. We have a few announcements per usual before we're going to do a little bit of grounding, and then we'll introduce tonight's talk and speaker. So I'll turn it over to Alon to do a few announcements.
Okay, yeah, great. So first, the announcement is obviously our tech is the screen is not working today, so we're going to be working with this monitor. I hope everybody can see it. But we'll also provide the slides afterwards. First, response papers, we're going to have those feedback to you by early next week or end of this week, so we're excited about that. If you haven't signed up with Jakia to meet in your 4 units for the class to talk about your final projects, please sign up with me. I'm going to be putting a similar Canvas announcement up for just office hours with me. A few of you have reached out and emailed, so I'm excited to meet with you. But if you haven't already signed up to meet with Jakia, then I'm excited to meet with you in the next few days.
Yeah. Feedback is coming. Did we say that?
Oh, yeah, I did.
Okay. So also, Stanford Powwow.
Yep, Stanford Powwow.
Shout out to Stanford Powwow.
Mother's Day weekend, this weekend, 48th annual Stanford Powwow. We just want, obviously, you know this is happening. We just wanted to also uplift that in this space. So thank you so much for all the labor that's been put into that, the continuous intergenerational work.
All weekend as well as on Saturday, I believe, fun run and walk. So definitely consider participating in that. I think that's actually all that we have. We're light on announcements now. It's mid-quarter, so we don't have so many. So I think we'll move right into, into some grounding, if that's all right. All right, so before we introduce tonight's topic and speaker, I'm going to bring us, as we do every single week, in what is one of the most valuable practices that we do, and one of my favorite, and what I've heard from you all, one of your favorites. I say that it's my favorite every week because I just want us to remember how incredibly valuable this is. I'm going to bring us into this space to get us grounded. So I'm going to ask you to put your feet on the ground. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. I'm just going to ask you to feel yourself. Feel your shoulders and your back, the things that you're holding there. It's all right to slump. It's all right to sit up straight, but just feel what's happening there. Feel your neck and your jaw and the tightness that we hold sometimes there. Feel a furrow in your eyebrows, wrinkle in your forehead, the things and the people that you're touching. Feel the things and the people that you might be avoiding touching. Just feel it. As you're feeling, I'd like you to consider situating yourself in place and time. It is Wednesday, May 8th, 2019. Somewhere it's May 9th, 2019. Somewhere that year and day and hour are millennia off. Somewhere that year and day and hour are not a thing, they do not matter. So feel yourself here in a ground, not the only ground, but on this ground. And feel the ground as part of a tiny piece of an enormous planet, which is a piece of an enormous galaxy. Feel how extraordinary, maybe not good and maybe not bad, but how remarkable it is to have everything come into place exactly like it did to be here, feeling what you're feeling right now. Feel how much the things that feel and are so big and so hard all still live in just a continuum. Think about both the magnitude and the marvelous simplicity of that. And together, let's inhale. And then push that out with noise. Inhale. Exhale with noise. So one last time, I want you to inhale all the fraught vexation of categories and identities and time together. Inhale. Hold it. Now exhale existence with noise. When you're ready, open your eyes. And just join us as we introduce tonight's lecture. Take your time. All right, welcome, y'all. Okay, so towards an introduction, I'm actually going to start with a quote. If we can stand still for all this, if we can carry on business as usual while our children in Trenton and in Atlanta are kidnapped and brutalized, then what do we stand for? It all but stops the heart. What underlies my work as I read it, and I suspect it is what keeps my children's stories from being unsufferably coy, cute, and sentimental, are the basic givens from which I proceed. 1, we are at war. 2, the natural responses to oppression are resistance. 3, the natural response to stress and crisis is not breakdown and capitulation, but transformation and renewal. The question I've been continually raising, from Gorilla My Love to the Seabirds Are Still Alive, and especially the Salt Eaters, is it natural? That is to say, is it sane, healthy, and in our interest to violate the contracts and covenants we have with our ancestors, with each other, with our children, with God? Where is our honor? Though there's much gaiety and horsing around in the Salt Eaters, it strikes me as an unrelentingly serious work in its motive and design, raising as it does these questions in whole and in parts, implications that speak to our decision whether or not we intend to have a future at all. End quote. It's the courage and curiosity to ask hard political existential questions like these that make Black feminist philosopher, novelist, and short story writer Toni Cade Bambara, who is the author of that quote and who's greeting you on screen, the source and inspiration for tonight's lecture. About a month and a half ago, March 25th, she was in Aries. Is that Aries? Yeah. Toni Cade Bambara, had she survived, would have celebrated her 80th birthday. Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? It's the opening line to Toni's novel, The Salt Eaters. And in a special collaboration with AAAS, it's also an installment of our ongoing project, Black Feminist Imagining. We couldn't think of anyone more fitting to center our thoughts than Toni Cade Bambara, whose Black feminist imagination was fiercely and explosively manifest in her writing and in her thought. Besides fiction work like The Salt Eaters or Gorilla My Love or These Bones Are Not My Child, she edited the anthology The Black Woman, and if you've been in my classes, you've read some entries from The Black Woman, and was asked to write the introduction for the off-sided volume, This Bridge Called My Back. She was entrusted to write the foreword of This Bridge Called My Back. She's such an OG that she's quoted or written about in so many canonical and iconic Black feminist anthologies and texts, including Barbara Smith's anthology Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology. And she's tenderly revered by other writers who remark frequently of her transformative work. Toni Morrison personally collected and edited a posthumous volume of her writing. Audre Lorde wrote Dear Toni. Alice Walker spoke of her in Looking to the Side and the Back. The Black women of Spelman College fought to house her archives. And the poet Sonia Sanchez, in a beautiful tribute, said, quote, her name is clustered on the hills, for she has sipped at the edge of rivers. Her words have the scent of the earth and the genius of the stars. I have stored in my blood the memory of your voice, Toni, linking continents, making us abandon Catholic minds. You spread yourself, rainbow-like, across seas, your voice greeting foreign trees, your voice stalking the evening stars. And a generation of people begin to question their silence, their poverty, their scarcity, because you had asked the most important question we can ask ourselves. What are we pretending not to know today? end quote. Her impact on Black women, her personal and figurative instantiation of the promise of Black women's collectivity is seen in so many ways, and it's truly a privilege to spend the time thinking about her work and all that she has to offer a series like this one. So to consider her work, we've invited the inimitable Dr. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan, author of the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, which is a part of a body of fiction exploring the intellectual, emotional, and bodily lives of young Black women through voice, music, and hip-hop inflected magical realist techniques. Her short stories have appeared in over a dozen publications, and she's received awards like the Charles Johnson Fiction Award, the James Baldwin Memorial Playwriting Award, and residencies from the National Endowment for the Arts and Breadloaf Writers Conference, among others. Dr. Sullivan also holds a PhD in English Literature from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in English and Creative Writing from Temple, and a BA in Afro-American Studies from Smith College, Stand Up African American Studies. She's currently assistant professor of English at Bryn Mawr College, and her scholarship is equally widely published and awarded. She's currently at work on a book manuscript exploring the relationships between sexuality, identity, and genre in contemporary women's literature of African diaspora, and she's absolutely gonna bless us tonight. So can we welcome her now?
So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Jakia, Alan, Yeji, and everybody whose labor made this visit possible. And thanks also to the folks who I had the opportunity to have dinner with and for the great conversation. This is such a special space. I can feel it already. And I'm excited and honored to be part of it as we discuss Toni Cade Bambara. So today I want to talk a little bit about Black feminism's literary engagements with collectivity and healing, specifically through pedagogical space, in the site of the classroom, beyond the site of the classroom, and how Black women literary writers in particular sort of use their work as an opportunity to critique classroom spaces and imagine new forms of pedagogical collectivity, again, both within and beyond the classroom. So to that end, I wanted to begin with two reflections on pedagogy, centering around Toni Cade Bambara, that I think are beautifully interrelated and really sort of demonstrate some of how the kind of literary collectivities that Jakia mentioned in the intro function vis-a-vis conversations around teaching. So this is Dear Toni. This is an excerpt, rather, from Dear Toni. Instead of a letter of congratulation upon your book and your daughter, whom you say you are raising to be a correct little sister. Lorde says, I dig your going and becoming. The lessons you teach your daughter are history. For I am your sister, corrected, already raised up. Our daughters will explore the old countries as curious visitors to our season, using their own myths to keep themselves sharp. This is in 1971. Then, in her interview with Claudia Tate in Black Women Writers at Work, Toni Cade Bambara reflects on her own teaching. I'm a very seductive teacher. Persuasive, infectious, overwhelming, irresistible. Let's face it, the teacher-student relationship we've been trained in is very colonial in nature. To rise above that, to insist of myself and of them that we refashion that relationship along progressive lines, demands a great deal of courage, imagination, energy, and will. So in these two moments, we see collective pedagogy at functioning in multiple ways between two beloved Black feminist writers. We see Lorde celebrating the publication of Toni Cade Bambara's edited collection, Tales and Stories for Black Folks, one of many of Bambara's works that would go on to teach generations of Black women and others crucial lessons on community and on learning. We also hear Lorde valuing that contribution as a gift of life, right? Sort of connecting it with the birth of a child, a teaching that will span generational lines like the birth of that child, passing on collective histories and enabling new generations of Black women to imagine their own sustaining, quote, myths. Then we see two Black feminist teachers reflecting on the place of creativity and myth-making in effective pedagogical work. And finally, we see a Black woman writer giving herself props for her own work, in one breath critiquing the coloniality of institutional pedagogical spaces, and then celebrating her own, quote, persuasive, infectious, overwhelming ability to reimagine those spaces, right, in ways that are powerful and, in fact, irresistible. So those of us who find ourselves compelled by or who've had the chance to study Black feminist literature, we also know that this word irresistible is actually one that's important for Toni Cade Bambara. Famously, in the introduction to this bridge called My Back, right, she coins this term, this line, to make the revolution irresistible. And I think it kind of bears sort of reading through, because she's also then think that irresistibility is also about healing and collectivity for her. She says, quite frankly, this bridge needs no forward. It is the afterward that'll count. The coalitions of women determined to be a danger to our enemies, as June Jordan would put it, right? Again, even that kind of referentiality, intertextuality, shouting out another Black feminist poet. Later she says, and the contracts we creative combatants will make to mutually care and cure each other into wholesomeness. And the blueprints we will draw up of the new order we will make manifest. And the personal unction we will discover in the mirror, in the dreams, or on the path across the bridge. The work to make revolution irresistible. So for Bambara, irresistible pedagogy is a pedagogy that resists the premise that learning has to carry with it the psychic and bodily trauma and violence that academic spaces that are premised on white, capitalist, supremacist, patriarchal exclusivity of knowledge tend to bring with them. And I'm sure many of us in this room kind of know exactly what she's talking about, right? You know, what makes Black feminist pedagogy irresistible is in fact the kind of will to collectively resist those structures and create something new, right? That we can learn from, and it's new spaces in which we can learn and teach ourselves and one another. This is a multi-directional drive, right? Sort of, it doesn't just sort of pull minds and voices toward its resistant vision. It also pushes us collectively into creative visions of new Black feminist futures. So today I want to talk about this drive of Black feminist pedagogy and how it works to reimagine spaces of teaching and learning in Black feminist literary culture, including foundational literary texts by recognized writers like Lorde and Bambara, but also I want to think about how those visions carry forward in the works of more contemporary fiction writers, and also Black feminists and Black women cultural producers whose works we are less likely to be encouraged to see as literary. And I'm thinking here specifically of rappers, right, and contemporary spoken word artists, Stacey Ann Chin, Lauryn Hill, Cardi B, Missy Elliott, all of whom sort of engage in critiques of pedagogical space in their creative writing. For both Lorde and Bambara, this liberatory pedagogy meant destabilizing the locus of authority in their classrooms on both curricular and bodily levels. So I had the chance to kind of look through some of Lorde's teaching papers. Fascinating. And if you're, most of them are at the CUNY archives in New York City. If you ever have the chance, she keeps copious, detailed teaching notes, right? I mean, beyond even those of us who consider ourselves attentive teachers, right? She's coming home after classes, taking, you know, again, sort of detailed notes on what's happening in the classroom. And she's also thinking quite a bit about how her own sort of space, her own presence in the classroom space can constantly be sort of shifted and changed depending on the needs of the class. And for her, this becomes a kind of pedagogical need of her own, right? So it's not just a matter of sort of giving of herself, she's actively invested in shifting the kind of power dynamic of the classroom space. And it's also really interesting, you know, in terms of the way she designs her syllabi, it's not unusual for Lorde to have a kind of intro English lit syllabus that is all women writers. And in fact, there's one that's all lesbian writers, right? Like not a dead white man in sight. And she's like, look, this is English literature, right? So those kinds of, where she's both thinking on the curricular kind of structural level and sort of the meanings of her body and her presence in the space. So you know, this kind of comes alongside interrogations and critiques of pedagogical space in the literary work as well, right? So we can think about, those of you who've had the chance to read Audre Lorde's Zami, right? The scene, in fact, several moments in which the classroom space is actually a site of violence, right? She's remanded to the Brownies group in her Catholic school classroom because she's Black, and is therefore precluded from running for class president, right? We can also think about Jamaica Kincaid, right? Several moments in Jamaica Kincaid's work in Annie John, in Lucy, where the site of the classroom is a space in which the Black girl protagonist can only see themselves as valuable if and when they're able to regurgitate through kind of rote repetition the words of dead white men poets, right, and colonial language, that's how their value is understood. And again, these are just two examples, but Toni Morrison, Ntozake Shange, Dion Brand, Gail Jones, Amata Aidu, Stacey Ann Chin, Danielle Evans, ZZ Packer, myself, again, Lauryn Hill, Cardi B. This critique of educational space is a theme of Black women's literary culture. And in these texts, the space of the classroom becomes a site not of learning, but of pain. And in fact, in these texts, we see that the real learning occurs outside of the classroom space, on the stoop, around the corner from school, where Lorde's protagonist finds her kind of first encounters with this fantasy Black girl companion figure named Toni, with whom she discovers kind of mutual pleasure and collaborative work that will guide her life's work. Or the graveyard outside of the campus grounds where Kincaid's narrator and her friends sort of discover mutual pleasure in each other's bodies, inventing their own languages, right, for sort of describing what they're learning in their coming of age. We can even think about the strip clubs across the street from Cardi B's school, right, where she learns, and she's constantly sort of framing them as just that, right, stripping across the street from my school. Those strip clubs are spaces where she learns about structures of sexual economy, learns to kind of find her voice in terms of sort of claiming her own sexuality against, several kind of cultural mores that stigmatize her sexuality. So this is a constant theme in Black feminist literature. Black feminist learning occurs in perpendicular spaces, spaces that are at enough of a remove from institutional sites of power that they enable collective healing, but close enough in view that they facilitate a collaborative critique. Black feminist writers reveal the pedagogical value of these outside spaces. And of course, here I'm using the term outside as Lorde does in Sister Outsider, right? The kind of gathering spaces for those upon whose outcast backs power coalesces. These are the spaces of the shorelines, as she puts it in A Litany for Survival. The spaces where Black women's loving sustains our living and feeds our collective vision. In these texts, this is where Black feminist pedagogy happens. In the hallways, on the subway, on the school playground, where the hegemonies of knowledge production rooted in the classroom can be critiqued through pleasurable modes of expression generated by Black women and girls. This is where the work of irresistible pedagogy is possible, because it happens in and through the voices, visions, and creative words of Black women and girls ourselves. So I want to turn now to talk about how this idea that I'm calling perpendicular sites of Black feminist pedagogy, how it works in Black feminist fiction, and maybe what keys those literary texts can offer us for thinking about the functions of pedagogy in our own life and how we can sort of recreate perpendicular spaces of pedagogy even within institutional spaces. Spoiler, I think it's happening right now, right? I think this is exactly what this class, in fact, is about, right? So creating spaces of learning and Black feminist teaching and intellectual exchange that feel very different, right? That don't feel like the kinds of pedagogical structures we're most familiar with. So I said one of the striking things about Lorde is sort of her investment in bringing her sort of thinking through her pedagogy into her personal life, right? So she keeps these detailed teaching notes, and even observations about her teaching often filter into her personal journals as well. So I found this dream journal that I think is fascinating and really goes far in terms of helping us understand how she rethinks the classroom space and her relationship to it. We get dream, a classroom. Am I the teacher or a student? I have not attended enough, either lost or late. Exam approaching. How can it be a class? How can I study or teach? I haven't attended enough. Doom must come, but will it? There aren't many people in the class when I go, but they don't seem disturbed by the irregularity. Sometimes the room is empty, and I think the class is happening somewhere else. So this, again, is another sort of instance of a moment where Black feminist pedagogy happens away from the institutional space of the classroom, in the somewhere else's of Black women's intellectual lives. And I think that Bambara's short story, The Lesson, is one of the texts that kind of shows this kind of perpendicular pedagogy in action. And it also demonstrates some of the ways in which, again, we might think about bringing this kind of perpendicular approach to Black feminist pedagogy into our work. within our own institutions. So I don't know, I'm sure some of you have probably read the lesson. It's one of her most taught short stories. It's in the collection Gorilla My Love. And basically in this story, a college-educated Black woman named Miss Moore gathers the narrator and a group of neighborhood children from Bambara's native Harlem. Shout out to Harlem, I'm also from Harlem. And she takes them on trips throughout the city in the summer, right? And they're educational trips around the city. On the day that the story takes place, she's taking them to FAO Schwartz, which is a very expensive toy store on Fifth Avenue. And she's taking them for what is ostensibly a lesson on math, but it also turns out to be an education in capitalism and class oppression. And so I'll just read, in fact, this quote from Gorilla My Love. So we heading down the street, and she's boring us silly about what things cost and what our parents make and how much goes for rent and how money ain't divided up right in this country. And then she gets to the part about we all poor and live in the slums, which I don't feature. And I'm ready to speak on that, but she steps out in the street and hails 2 cabs just like that. Then she hustles half the crew and hands me a $5 bill and tells me to calculate 10% tip, and we off. So despite the lesson's emphasis on equations and sums and numbers, it's Bambara's use of language and narrative interiority that reveals the nuances of the learning process for the young Black girl narrator and highlights her brilliant intersectional critique of education. In her voice, we learn early on that the children are forced to dress up in order to be, quote, presentable for Miss Moore, whose college degree affords her the respect of neighborhood parents, though the fact that she is single, dark-skinned, and childless render her a complex object of admiration and derision in the neighborhood. The imperative to perform status as a requisite for education is stifling and physically uncomfortable for the children. Thus, the narrator complains, while Miss Moore is, quote, knocking herself out about arithmetic, the starch in my pinafore is scratching the shit out of me, and I'm really hating this nappy-head bitch and her goddamn college degree. Here, intertwined logics of racial, gender, and socioeconomic power activate the burden of representation, immediately triggering the narrator's suspicion of Miss Moore and her critique of familiar pedagogical practices, also creating several layers of distance, right, between the narrator and Miss Moore, and therefore between the narrator and the learning experiences that Miss Moore has curated for them. So this critique comes to shape the narrator's engagements with space over the course of the story, which is why I've pulled this quote for y'all. As the group moves through the streets of the sidewalks of the city, the narrator is constantly searching for relief from both psychic and bodily discomfort and seeking pleasure. She muses, quote, I say we ought to get to the subway because it's cooler, and besides, we might meet some cute boys. Then, as the children move through the doors of the expensive toy store, she compares them to, quote, a glued-together jigsaw done all wrong, a state made all the more painful because people looking at us. And of course, this notion of wrongness, right, also, may bear some kind of resonances to June Jordan's poem about my rights, right? I am not wrong. Wrong is not my name. The idea that the kind of simultaneous invisibility and hypervisibility of Black girls, Black feminist subjects, Black queer people constantly render us sort of captive or threaten to render us captive to a feeling of shame, right, from which it's very difficult to break out, right? This idea of sort of wrong becomes the identity. And we see the narrator sort of struggling with that, right? We're like a jigsaw puzzle glued together all wrong. So being the brilliant Black girl that she is, though, the narrator names this feeling immediately as shame, right? The word comes up, in fact, a couple of times in the story. The shame of failed presentability, the impossible burden of representation, and the pain of hypervisible wrongness all lead the narrator to anger and a feeling that, quote, I sure want to punch somebody in the mouth. Yet, unlike the shame of the classroom space and the stifled angers that space produces for Black girls, this anger is part of Miss Moore's lesson on the structures of race and class that shape the city and the students' lives. Ms. Moore thus asks the children how they feel in the space of the store, what they think about what they see there. And again, engaging in the power of Black feminist literary voicing, the narrator expresses her anger, remarks that Ms. Moore's question-focused teaching style, quote, really pains my ass. If you're going to mess up a perfectly good swim day, at least you could do is have some answers. So here Bambara demonstrates Black girls' critical literacies, right? And the extent to which, as Bettina Love and Bell Hooks and others have pointed out, Black girls are, quote, always engaging in critiques of both culture and their own learning experience without any help from school officials. From her extra-institutional, unofficial location, Miss Moore is able to make space for the narrator's anger, which she eventually expresses out loud, asking, "What you bring us here for, Miss Moore?" Her anger named, the narrator leaves the space of the store, getting back on the train, returning home with her friend Sugar. Here again, learning happens in motion, in the dynamic space between the shaming site of structural power and the familiarity of home. Me and Sugar at the back of the train, watching the tracks whizzing by, large and then small, then getting gobbled up in the dark. I'm thinking about this tricky toy I saw in the store. It cost $35. $35 would pay the rent and the piano bill too. Who are these people that spend that much for performing clowns and $1,000 for toy sailboats? What kind of work they do and how they live, and how come we ain't in on it? Where we are is who we are, Ms. Moore always pointing out. I'm going to the West End and then over to the Drive to think this day through. The reader witnesses the narrator's interior monologue as she considers class, space, and capital while moving through the cityscape with her homegirl Sugar. The movement of the narrative echoes this process, revealing through her anger that she has, in fact, been listening to and engaging Ms. Moore's lessons all along. Ms. Moore's statement, "Where we are is who we are," echoes Lorde's statement in her teaching journals, in which she asks students, "Why do you think I am here? Where do you think we are going?" In both of these moments, the stability and authority of the individual I recedes for both, quote, teacher and student, giving way to a collective first-person plural we. Where we are is who we are. How come we ain't in on it? Where do you think we are going? Both Lorde and Bambara's narrator must step outside the site of power, must move to the in-between space of somewhere else, the train, the dream, in order to think the Black woman we into possibility and imagine ourselves into a collective future. Bambara's first-person poetics here reveal a key aspect of her pedagogical and revolutionary vision. And this kind of slippage between the individual and the collective pronoun, the I and the we, happens over and over again in Bambara's papers and in Lorde's papers. What's interesting about it is that the I functions as the individual, right, the student or the teacher, but it also functions as a marker of collectives, communities, and Black feminist movements. As Bambara argues in her essay on the issue of roles, quote, "Revolution begins with the self. The individual, the basic revolutionary unit, must be purged of poisoning and lies that put the entire movement in peril." This unlearning for Bambara begins in the, quote, "basic revolutionary unit of the self" and extends outward toward classrooms, communities, and movements. So this notion of the basic and of the base as a kind of shifting site of Black feminist learning shows up in surprising ways and with surprising frequency throughout Bambara's work. And in fact, Jakia, in your introduction, right, you flagged another one, this idea of sort of the basic given from which I proceed. This idea of the basic kind of occurs for her often as the site of a turn inward toward a kind of inward-facing dialogue among Black women at the close of the 1960s. And this is in the introduction to the 1970 anthology, The Black Woman, where she argues, quote, "Our energies now seem to be invested in and derived from a determination to touch and unify. What typifies the current spirit is an embrace of the community and a hard-headed attempt to get basic with each other." She extends this idea in her essay, Thinking About the Play The Great White Hope, in which she argues, if we can get basic and be clear about our priorities, we might be able to get basic and be clear about our possible allies. For her, this absence of basic political connection is a failure of educational space in particular. Quote, "For the very movements that could provide us with insights into histories of systemic violence are those movements that are not traditionally taught in the schools." For Bambara, it's Black women writers, in fact, that make space for this missing collective knowledge, using their creative work, as she puts it, as quote, "part of their effort to be clear, analytical, personal, basic, part of their efforts to piece together an overview of ourselves too long lost among the bills of sale and letters of transit." Now for me, as a hip hop head and a lover of contemporary Black culture and Black language, it's impossible in 2019 not to spend some time thinking about Bambara's model of the word basic. If we were to go to Harmony House, Black House, several other spaces on campus and ask a Black woman undergrad in 2019 what basic means in their extracurricular lives, they would probably give a definition that's somewhat distinct from Bambara's, maybe even including some colorful expletives. So, to figure this out, I had to consult everybody's favorite real-time, crowdsourced, sort of epistemological linguistic etymology of Black vernacular repository, UrbanDictionary.com. Twitter would have been a good one, though. That's for like the book version of this talk, right? So interestingly, right? So Urban Dictionary offers several definitions of basic, including someone devoid of defining characteristics that might make a person interesting, extraordinary, or simply worth devoting time or attention to. 2, right? Lacking intelligence and unable to socialize on even an elementary level. 3, annoyingly frustrating because of the above. And then we get the example, and just in case you need a usage guide. Oh, her? Don't even worry about her, girl. She's so basic. So reading Bambara, so of course I'm like, okay, how are we going to theorize this, right? How does this work? But I think reading Bambara's Black feminist pedagogies reveals that basic in Black feminist literary culture actually serves both of these functions, right? It works as a way to critique systemic ascriptions of basicness that deny Black women's sophistication, knowledge, and intellectual value, but it also functions as a way to imagine foundational locations, bases, right, from which that intellectual value can be acknowledged, nurtured, nourished, and shared. Applying this contemporary parlance, right, sort of the basic that Twitter, right, would hold for us, we could in fact say that Bambara's narrator reads Miss Moore as basic. Early in the story, she observes, quote, "This lady moved on our block with nappy hair and proper speech and no makeup. And quite naturally, we laughed at her, and we kind of hated her too." Right? Yet Ms. Moore also constructs herself as a crucial pedagogical base, a moving site and resource for the foundations of Black feminist pedagogy, and a, quote, basic revolutionary unit that aims to critique and address failures of formal education within her community. I find reading Ms. Moore as a moving base of Black feminist pedagogy extremely helpful in thinking about how anti-colonial teaching can shift, move, and grow beyond strictures of institutional culture, even when they occur in institutional space. Ms. Moore also helps me consider how the most crucial pedagogies sometimes appear basic when they are actually sophisticated, dazzling, and revolutionary. So as basic tools of literary pedagogy go, there's probably none that's more familiar than the fairy tale. And so I want to turn now to one of Bambara's funniest stories to think about how she rewrites the most familiar narratives to highlight the basic logics of oppression that these narratives perpetuate and create the kind of basic connection she finds crucial to Black feminist pedagogy. So I'm going to play a few minutes of her reading from her short story, The Golden Bandit. And this is at a 1985 reading in the Library of Congress. So it's about 4 minutes. Just take a listen.
We'll tell a story, you and I, and dedicate it to Lorde, Latrice. Once upon a time, there was a little yellow-haired gal named Goldilocks who was walking through the woods and came upon a lovely house. She knocked on the door, but no one was at home. Did she go away? What did she do? She broke in. What do you call people who break in other people's houses? This burglar child then went into the living room, where her attention was arrested by some fine crafted furniture, in particular 3 chairs. Did she mind her own business? What did she do? And what do you call people who break up other people's stuff? A vandal. This burglar child vandal then went into the folks' kitchen, and proceeded to lift the lid on the chicken, pop it in the grease, put her nose in the peas and rice in the iron pot cooker, went into the oven and put her finger in the macaroni and cheese bubbling up and crusting over the side of the earthenware. Did she act like she had some good home training? What did she do? Now, what do you call people who put the grabs in other people's stuff and they weren't invited in the first or second place? A thief. What? A lumpen? Did I hear a lumpen? This burglar child vandal thief then went upstairs to the folks' bedroom. No. You're supposed to say. The child then went up to the folks' bedroom and got in their bed with her shoes on. When folks came home, did she beg their pardon for all these antisocial goings-on? Did she offer to call her daddy to fix that door? Did she call her mama to replace those chairs in her charger card? Having messed with their groceries, did she call Church's Chicken for delivery? Did she take the sheets down to the speed wash and launder them? Did she even say good evening? What did she do? She ran away. Now, when she came stumbling into her own home, out of breath, overheated, hair a little matted on one side, clothes a little crumpled, did she fess up and tell her parents about her anti-communal behavior? Did she elicit the help of her parents, presumably grown-ups, presumably capable of exploring in a fearless manner the normative values that lay at the bottom of this overprivileged, underdeveloped, sociopathic heifer? Did she engage in principled self-criticism? No. She said some bears were chasing her. She a liar. Is this little girl your hero? Do you think she is an exemplary model of community behavior? Do you think it is hip to give the library version of the Golden Bandit to little children before we have assumed the responsibility of encouraging and equipping them in a critical manner? Thank you.
There's so much to be said about so much of what's going on there. And there's also, so part of what's interesting is that, there's a print version of this story that has been anthologized widely. And it's interesting to think about sort of what orality does in the audio version, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But this idea that sort of retelling basic familiar narratives really helps Bambara to kind of highlight the basic logics that undergird those narratives, right? And the basic logics of oppression. So here we see her enact these functions of Black feminist pedagogy through this retelling of the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And in it, of course, we hear her irresistible humor, right? That she's known for, that she knows herself for, and that others have commented on, her charm. But we also see her using that humor to reshape pedagogical space. The story of Goldilocks, of course, is not just an allegory, but is a cautionary tale about property, mobility, and ownership of space, right? Sort of whose house belongs to whom. Yet Bambara's telling of the story resituates the parable in Black space, in a Black space in particular whose cultural markers are not wood shacks or porridge or, wooden chairs, but iron skillets, bubbling pots of mac and cheese, Church's chicken, and the classic Black cultural imperative of good home training, which is itself a gesture to the communal pedagogies that facilitate Black safety, collectivity, healing, and survival. This Black feminist retelling of this very basic story thus reveals the political danger and the political potentials of the allegory and cautionary tale forms, using the truth-telling power of Black feminist literary traditions of naming. by insisting on naming Goldilocks repeatedly as, quote, this burglar, vandal, thief child, and more, right? And then finally declaring she a liar. Bambara upends a kind of pedagogical tool that's ubiquitous in American culture, the fairy tale. She comes at it sideways to expose the oppressive racial and class logics at the core of our most basic cultural narratives, critiquing the, quote, normative values that lay at the bottom of this overprivileged, underdeveloped, sociopathic heifer. Side note, there's a lot to be said about kind of the mobilization of languages that may seem to be patriarchal and sexist languages in Black feminist literature, and even sort of the playing out of antipathies and antagonisms through language in Black feminist literature. Audre Lorde's Eye to Eye is one place that I often go for thinking about that. It needs to be said because it does come up, and I just kind of wanted to put it out there. Maybe it's something we can come back to in the Q&A. So importantly, Bambara also names the pedagogical function of this creative recasting directly. She states her aim to expose the library version of the Golden Bandit that's, quote, taught to little children before we have assumed the responsibility of encouraging and equipping them in a critical manner. And it's interesting, in the printed text, actually, Bambara uses the term of the official version, right, rather than the library version. I like this because, you know, who doesn't want a library critique, right? But also because the framing of library then sort of locates the official locus of knowledge production in institutional space, right? The space of the library. So we also, sort of through this rethinking of space and pedagogical space, in the audio version, we also hear Bambara turning the space of the Library of Congress into a site of perpendicular Black feminist pedagogy. Right, we hear the humor and the charm that she's known for. We also hear her work to destabilize herself as the sole locus of authority, right, and power within the situation. She kind of enlists her audience as collaborators in the storytelling process, you know, sort of deploying the classic oral literary Black tradition of call and response. But she also doesn't destabilize herself entirely, right? She maintains enough authority to guide her interlocutors on the path that she has laid out for them, right? So there are these moments where she's asking questions, she's not quite getting the answer that she wants. She course corrects, right? And sort of guides the audience toward the outcomes and the kind of the learning that she has curated for them. In this way, she enacts both the principal self-criticism and the community behavior that she finds dangerously absent in the pedagogy of the Tale of Goldilocks itself. She's self-critical enough to destabilize her own power at the front of the room, but holds on to her authority just enough to make sure that the room stays close enough to the path that she's opened up for them and to glean the crucial anti-oppressive insights at the story's end. The space of the lecture hall thus becomes a site of Black feminist pedagogy as Bambara draws her audience into the process of critiquing and reimagining a narrative of power as basic and familiar as a childhood nursery rhyme. So I want to kind of bring in one more critical creative voice, and then I'll just read very briefly from a short story of my own. But this Black feminist vision of the basic, as I kind of mentioned, offers space for us to rethink also the intellectual, sort of how we designate intellectual value beyond institutional canonicity, right? It allows us to think about sort of where we might find critiques of pedagogy in spaces that are not recognized as intellectually valuable in standard pedagogical structures. And so, of course, for me, that brings me to hip hop. So perhaps the most legible critique of education in Black women's hip hop is Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, right, which celebrated its 20th anniversary last year. I was really going a little bit further than that, so that's good. And, you know, there's a lot to be said about, Joan Morgan actually recently came out with a book about the miseducation of Lauryn Hill. She begat this. There's a lot to be said about critiques of pedagogy there. But Black women's rap music has extended these critiques of education laid out in Black feminist literature for decades before and since miseducation, often in ways that more directly articulate a Black feminist critique. Missy Elliott is a rich figure through which to explore Black feminist critiques in hip-hop precisely because of her complex relationships to intersectional power. The wide speculation about her sexuality, the shifting dialogues about her body shape and size, Her unpredictable, often unclassifiable expressions of masculine, feminine, and other gender styles, along with her brilliant poetic lyricism and her aesthetics of experiment with which she manipulates the formal devices of hip-hop, all of these render her a fascinating figure through which to explore hip-hop's Black feminist literary critiques. In her 2001 song and video for Gossip Folks, which is a collaboration with Miss Jade and Ludacris, Missy turns her creative, critical lens toward the site of the classroom in particular, highlighting the importance of non-institutional sites of learning in Black girls' intellectual lives. Yeah, I mean, Missy, I mean, as a scholar, it's dope to see people starting to really take Missy seriously and give her props. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of her videos and her brilliance. Here we see Missy critiquing power and knowledge at the site of the classroom through a critique of knowledge of her own body or knowledge about her own body. So the video opens in a corridor of school lockers with a dialogue in which gossip about Missy stands in for knowledge about her embodiment and her sexual desire. As the beat drops, these false knowledges swirl around her. I heard she eats 1 cracker a day. I heard she was married to Tim and started messing with Trina. Yet rather than dispel and correct these rumors about her body, Missy reframes the locus of authority away from these voices and instead centers her own, commanding the characters, stop talking about who I'm sticking and licking, just mad it ain't y'all. In this clapback, she kind of pierces what scholar C. Riley Snorton refers to as the glass closet, in which Black sexuality is constantly confined by rumor, speculation, and hypervisibility. Missy critiques a paradigm in which other perspectives about her body and sexuality stands in for knowledge and establishes herself not only as the only source for knowledge about her body, but also the only figure capable of choosing what knowledge about her should be shared, how, when, and with whom. In the world of the video, Missy does the schooling, and both masculine educational authorities and hating Black girl peers must learn. And as with Lorde and Bambara, this pedagogy happens not within the classroom, but in the tangent spaces, the perpendicular spaces, in the sites of the hallways, the school bus, the cafeteria, where Missy claims space as the authoritative voice for knowledge about her own body. What happens within the classroom space is actually a direct critique of the primacy of normative classroom spaces and locuses of knowledge. The classroom scene shows Faison Love as an apathetic teacher who thumbs lackadaisically through papers while students engage in a pretty poppin' spitball fight. His role is strictly disciplinary and punitive, right? The only evidence of his effect in the classroom is in fact this image of Miss Jade standing at the chalkboard, writing repeatedly, "I will not gossip with Missy in class," which of course gestures toward the kinds of colonial pedagogical models that Bambara critiques. It also connects to those moments in Jamaica Kincaid we were talking about, and a lot of post-colonial Black feminist literature that, again, sort of repetition and memorization become tools by which Black women's voices are kind of evacuated, right, and punished. So here, this colonial legacy of forced repetition serves not only to usurp Black women's voices, but also to punish conversation and collective engagement between Black women. I will not gossip with Missy in class. The other thing that's going on here that's very interesting is the beat shifts, right? And it shifts to, in fact, a very basic old school kind of beat. It's actually a song, Funky Fresh Dress, that's also a collaboration with Miss Jade. And that line, funky fresh, dressed to impress, ready to party. Okay, this is a pop quiz. Does anybody recognize vaguely? So somewhat, right? It sounds familiar. So this is actually MC Light's, this is the beginning of MC Light's verse in Self-Destruction, right? Which is 1989, I think, which was itself a pedagogical tool, right? It's a collaboration, Stop the Violence movement. This is the moment where Black on Black crime is being sort of hotly discussed in the media. And this is a kind of collabo song, right? Another sort of collaborative communal sort of gesture toward a community politic that, you know, ends up reinforcing masculinist logics and sort of reinforcing respectability politics in many ways. MC Light is the only woman rapper on that track, right? And her verse is the only verse that I think you could make the argument sort of escape some of those logics. So the throwback here to the basic operates on several levels, right? Visual, linguistic, but also even sonic, right? In the kind of bringing back of the basic old school beat. So So it's interesting to think about how even like this, I won't even try to go back, but the other thing that I think is going on here is that the dancing in the hallway, right, becomes a kind of return to this idea of the pedagogical site as a site that can also be pleasurable and in fact irresistible, right? It's a kind of irresistible collective space for Missy of pleasure, critique, and healing, even as, again, it's a space in which she's able to school people about knowledge around her own body. So I want to kind of close, I am also a fiction writer, I want to close with a couple of minutes of fiction. In preparing for this talk, actually, I realized that like Bambara, like Lorde, like Kincaid, like Morrison, like Missy, like Cardi B, in my fiction as well, in my creative work as well, sort of institutional sites of knowledge and pedagogy constantly fail my Black women, girl, and Black queer people characters. And I hadn't really sort of put that together until I began to work on this scholarly project. But I wanted to read a few pages of a story of my own that I think really makes similar critiques and also kind of, again, locates the site of productive, pleasurable knowledge and learning outside of and tangential to the classroom space. So I'm going to read from a short story called Snow Fight. And this story, too, uses a lot of colorful, explicit language, including the N-word. It's also an older story. I wrote this story many years ago, I'll just say. And so there are a couple of R. Kelly references that I think maybe deserve, kind of forewarning at this point as well. And again, I hope that we can talk about any of these things that come up for you in the Q&A. So this is Snow Fight. This old white nigga starts talking and everybody shuts up real tight for a second. Then they start screaming, "Ay, ay," cheering like on the ground watching Pito and Sliminy try to murder each other one-on-one, or when Sandra and Ana Rosario skip Mr. Dominic's math class to go snatch clothes from on 125th and rock their new baby fat jeans straight through 8th period, still with the plastic lock tags on. They ain't even hear what he said, and I'm not gonna front. I didn't really hear it either, it was so loud. I was just surprised to see him open his mouth and even more surprised to see the snow come out. And when he said shit, forget it. It was a wrap. I always wondered what one of those random old white niggas on the train would do if you touched them or winked at them, rubbed your ass on them one time when it was real crowded or something. I thought maybe they would turn pink and start sweating and maybe pulling their necktie like that old video for Baby Got Back. Sir Mix-a-Lot, I think, when he sees the black girl with the fatty and hits him too closer than white people like to go. But your boy didn't do any of that. All he did was clear his throat and say, "Hey," real loud, like Principal Scapriani does at assemblies when light-skinned Chris and them or some other niggas is acting loud, singing R. Kelly songs to the girls in the back row. Scapriani screams, "Hey," louder, and they sing louder, going from the Chocolate Factory album and Step in the Name of Love straight back to some shit I can't even remember the title about, "Your body's calling for me." Scapriani says, "Hey," loud, but not loud as 5 or 10 niggas singing to cute girls, but who got the microphone? You can feel his voice shaking the walls from out the speakers. If you're not talking, you can even feel it under your feet. Me, I sit with my homegirl Patricia, and she teaches me words in Spanish. When Chris and them act up, she says they acting mad bobo. And when Scapriani starts sweating like the white dude in the video, his face shining like a ham hock, she says que parece cerdo. I laugh because my homegirl is funny, and because I like how things she say in Spanish be so close to what I think in English. I don't know, shit like that be real funny to me. Sometimes if Dominique showed up to school that day and decided to sit with us instead of her flavor of the week nigga, she'd bite her braids and how she do and say some Jamaican shit about that the man a pure wharf dog. But I'm not good at understanding all that. She made me laugh in the same way, though, for the simple fact that when me and Patricia went to her house, she had oxtails and fried fish and hush puppies, but her whole family called it oxtail with no S, and they call hush puppies festival. And when Patricia asked what kind of fish it was, Dominique said it was saltfish, but Patricia said she could have swore it was bacalao. Crazy how shit be different as night and day, then turn out to be the same damn thing in just a different language or a different sauce. I don't know, I just laugh. Principal Scapriani doesn't usually have to shake the ground more than once, even though they say 155 is the worst school in the city. They only say that, okay, because of that time the twins, Andrew and Alex, put on some black t-shirts and brought heat to school last year, their senior year, okay, in April, not even 2 months before their graduation, and tried to shoot the nose off the Sphinx statue in the lobby, talking about this is political. Now we have to go through metal detectors every time we come in and out. The line be down the street almost to the train station, and still they expect us to get to class on time. What is that? And now we supposed to be these badass kids. Meanwhile, the worst shit that happens on a regular day is some dumb ass, bobo ass, wharf dog ass niggas singing Sex Me to a bunch of 8th grade girls who can't even be bothered. Down at the other end of the 9 train, the car, they talking so loud I can't even hear a damn thing, laughing and running their mouths about kuliki takati, kuliki takata, and diablo que esa vaina. I don't know exactly what they're saying, but it's loud as hell and it sounds like they're having a good time, so. Dominique is too, talking to some nigga I have never seen, so I just quietly sit and do me, try to pick more words out the air. Then I notice this old white nigga, his back all bent over like a pterodactyl or some shit. This Jurassic Park nigga, face all up in a newspaper. He's not making no noise, but his lips are moving fast as the keys on one of them old-ass typewriters, and I'm wondering how long he's gonna ignore all this loudness bumping up against him. When the doors open at 125th, the only outside stop in the city, light-skinned Chris and some other nigga jump out the door, and I think it's weird because Chris live on my block and we both get off at 145th, but then he comes back to the train with a handful of snow and throws it across the whole car and hits Slimity right in the neck. Everybody's like, ooh, and niggas start laughing. The train makes that doorbell noise to let you know the door is about to close, but Slimity sticks his little foot between them and reaches out. The doors click and bang against his foot like they don't know what to do, till then he comes back in with a whole armful of snow. Now it's on. Everybody's laughing and cheering in no language at all, really. Some girls in the middle of the car reach out there too and start flicking snow at each other. The bells keep ringing and niggas keep blocking the doors, reaching out and throwing big-ass handfuls of dirty gray snow at each other. And then I catch it. And right then, I'm glad that I'm the kind of person that watches shit instead of getting caught up in it. Light-skinned Chris was aiming for Slimity, but his right hand slipped down the pole that he was leaning on. He lost his balance, and this old white nigga got caught in the face with a clump of nasty gray snow. Chris looked like he saw his mom ghost coming for him. Hey! Like Principal Scapriani, and everybody shuts up quick, like if he was going to send them to the glass box or expel them. Then, I don't know, everybody starts cheering, screaming 8 times louder than before, like if the Knicks were winning a championship, like that. Like this was the funniest, best shit in the world. This old white nigga, the only one on a train full of loud, rowdy, laughing us, and he gets caught in the face with snow, and what was he gonna do? Niggas was cracking up. Then he said something, shit, and it was over. People was dying laughing so hard. Dominique was biting her braids hard now, looking like she about to piss herself. The doorbells rang again, and nobody stopped them this time, everybody caught up and laughing so hard. The snow fell out of old boy's mouth and niggas laughed some more. They kept laughing after that and went back to doing their thing, just a little more loud and a little more happy. But you know, I watched. And I'm glad too. Because with everything that went down, the funniest shit to me, the part of this story that nobody else even knows, was the way your boy tried so hard to keep his typewriter lips straight while everybody else was laughing. It was me. Just me. I was the only one that caught this old white nigga stretching his face over his teeth and scrunching up his neck and his eyes just to keep from laughing with us. I laughed hard then, real low in my stomach, because I never would have guessed that after all that, even this old white nigga himself would have an urge to smile. I don't know, shit like that is real funny to me. Thank you.
How spectacular was that? I feel so full. Another applause, please. We definitely want to get to audience questions. So I know that you have them. I won't take long. I'm just going to ask a couple, actually. So if you want to hang on to what you've got or write them down, then we'll move to you very, very quickly. Thank you again so much for taking us through all those steps and never dropping us one time, which is an incredible model of pedagogy just then. That's tremendous and that I'm really moved by right now. One of the things that I'm wondering, to back up a few steps, is the really brilliant motif or metaphor or trope or thought around perpendicular pedagogy. Can you walk us through like the mechanics of that, right? Perpendicular versus parallel, perpendicular versus some other kind of formation. Can you talk to us about your choice about perpendicular? You described how it manifests.
Right.
But tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, this is something that I'm really just thinking through. And I think it's the touching, right? The intersection. And I was careful not to use that term just because it means so many things and more than I think I have had time to fully theorize in this talk, certainly. But the notion that these are sites that are in fact in contact with one another, right? And this is why, again, I think about, sort of the train on the way to the museum, or on the way to school, the school bus, right? Even sort of the framing of I'm thinking about Kincaid, right? And the graveyard space that it's locus, right? The way the location is described is constantly described in relationship to the school. The idea that the school is invoked. So this is a space that is not simply sort of distinct from the space of the school, right? But it's defined by its difference from the space of the school because it is in constant contact, either, sort of conceptually, sort of theoretically, or even literally. And I think that this is also a place where perpendicular is important to me. I really am invested in, and believe it or not, there was like a whole other section that I cut. We were talking about this, where I'm thinking about sort of how this works in my own pedagogy. I'm invested in thinking about how we can create these spaces even within the physical space, right? And even perhaps sort of engaging some of the customs and resources, at least, right, of institutional spaces. So I think perpendicular right now is standing in for me as a way to articulate that there is, in fact, contact, and that's part of the contact enables both the respite and the critique, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you. Which draws me to be really curious about what you were saying about Audre Lorde talking about the meaning of her body and her presence in the classroom. So if like perpendicular pedagogical space in an institutional classroom, wherein we're all, even in breathing today, we were talking about things that we're avoiding touching, bodies that we're avoiding, like acknowledging as bodies, including our own. Often, what is like perpendicular pedagogical space offered to the classroom with this respect to not only the body and the presence of the body of the teacher, of ourselves, the teachers and the students, and the sort of movement back and forth of that, as well as the business of mutual pleasure and collaboration. How is that going to happen in a classroom? And I don't ask that like incredulously. I'm like, no, how?
No, well, I mean, I really feel like y'all are doing it. Just in the sense that, first of all, I think that, so for Lorde, right, like both Lorde and Bambara, they teach together and in the City College Seek program. They both are invested in teaching in multiple physical spaces and are constantly thinking about their embodiments in their work, but also their embodiments in the classroom. And I think, I say that to say, I think that part of it is about sort of the physical material space, right? Moving a class from one space to another, holding a class in a space that is not traditionally a classroom space, right? Or sort of the bringing of various bodies into a classroom space changes the physical space, right? So this is perhaps like maybe, a kind of more macro way into this question, but I think it's very real. And there are reasons why classes like this one, right now I'm teaching a class called Narrativity and Hip Hop at Bryn Mawr. And, Bryn Mawr is about 25, 30 minutes from Philadelphia, but they're working on this pilot program where some of the classes are taking place in the city. Just again, sort of the presence of bodies in a different space, I think, changes, or at least sort of opens space, right, enables different sort of modes of bodily engagement. And so that's kind of like my abstract answer. But I also think, for Bambara and Lorde, again, they're constantly aware of their bodies as, sort of symbols of various, sort of forms of derision, objects rather of derision, but also objects of pleasure, right, and sort of vehicles of pleasure. This notion of irresistibility, I think, occurs multiple times for Bambara for a reason. And when we read other writers talking about her, they're constantly talking about that she's got this kind of infectious energy that clearly is hard won and hard earned. And I think many of us can relate to that, right? Sort of knowing that it takes work. I mean, she says this, sort of work and will to embody pleasure. And it's difficult to make the choice to bring that into the classroom space. But it is an available choice. And so on a more practical level, for me, I think it's sort of, like everything from like fashion, right? Kind of like what one chooses to wear in the classroom space. Right now, I always have the long twist going on. I usually have some type of color in my hair, and that is very much a choice of sort of representing who I am and sort of how I feel most comfortable. And I do that to authorize my students, right, to do the same, right? And we were talking about this over dinner. I asked my students to call me Professor Sullivan in an environment where I'm not not everybody does that at a small liberal arts school, but it's precisely to model that somebody named Professor Sullivan can look like this, right? And that you have to kind of get to me through that language. And then once you get to me, I can be whoever I actually am, or at least as close as I can be. The last thing that I'll say is I think this is why I keep bringing up the physical discomfort that Bambara's narrator feels, right? She's constantly sort of the pinafore, and we know those moments, right? We know that feeling that the space of the institution assaults our bodies, our hearts, our minds. And so I think sort of creating spaces that can feel pleasurable. For me, that's teaching a class on hip hop. Every time I play a song, I tell the students, like, listen, you can dance, you can nod your head, whatever. You don't have to, but you can. Like, bringing the body into that space. I also feed them, right? Because like that's real too. It's necessary. It's pleasurable, And that's all of those are kind of, those are choices. Those are choices that are at least they depart from the norms and customs of the institution, and they're risky. For me as an untenured person, also, you think about these things, but these risks feel well worth it to me.
Super beautiful. I have questions about the base and the basic. I have questions about language, which I will reserve until you all get quiet. So I want to yield to you for now. I've got you covered. If you're feeling shy, is what I want to say.
Don't be shy.
But don't be shy, please.
Hello, my name's Vance. Mahalo. Thank you for your talk. I'm kind of wondering, there's some brilliant ideas you shared about restructuring our educational spaces to be very different. And I'm wondering about the other, I guess, path of operating and creating new pedagogical spaces and just new institutions and centers where we don't have to operate oppositionally to these structures that are not set up to hold us, and where you've seen that and how you see those playing out between altering our institutions and creating new ones.
Yeah. So your name again?
Vance.
Okay. Did I get it wrong? I'm sorry. That's a good question. My first thought is I think that this is the work of artists. You don't have to stand up. You can stand. I think that this is the work of artists, right? Like I think that the ability to and the kind of the task, Audrey calls it the life pursuit, right? She doesn't talk about like jobs or careers. She talks about life pursuits. Choosing as one's life pursuit, right? The kind of imagining of structures and realities that are wholly separate from our own. I think that that's creative vision, and I say that with joy and optimism, but also with a kind of critique. I think that that is an operation of again sort of creativity and imagination. In other words, I don't think we're there in that world, because any organization that's going to function, like the people who run it need to eat, right? And like so we can't fully kind of get out of structures of power, or at least we haven't yet. But I think it's crucially important to then engage the work of artists and of activists, right? And I think, I'm all about using the resources of the institution to critique the institution and create other spaces. And so I think, again, a class like this, not that I feel like I'm just like gassing this class, but I think it's amazing. you know, sort of like bringing in all of these different voices, right? Sort of supporting them, right? Sort of treating them well, supporting them for the work that they do that is extra institutional work, right? In other words, extra as in sort of outside of the institution. If there is a request for advice in that question, my advice would be engage the work of anti-oppressive, anti-colonial artists, because they are creating those visions, you know, and support them, support their work, circulate their work, share their work, teach their work, send it to your friends, tweet it out, right? Because I think that I believe that the hope is a kind of really wide scale shifting of consciousness that has to come from artists. Thank you for your question.
While we're raising other hands, so
yes,
I see one there, but I want to say like that it feels literally like a beautiful, cool breeze on my face to experience the level of citationality that you're giving. That's because you know Audre Lorde, you know like 2 quotes. Which isn't enough. Listen to all the things that she said, just in these talks and in this Q&A. All the beautiful things that Toni Cade Bambara said, that Jamaica Kincaid said, all these other Black women authors and novelists who you might have never heard of, Dionne Brand, Gail Jones, all these people. So thank you for bringing all of them in here. We were talking Toni Cade Bambara, but you brought them all. So thank you so much for that. I just wanted to say.
No, I appreciate that. And Charles, right?
That's me.
Okay, I'm just gonna respond really
Please
quick,
do.
and then we're gonna, because I think when you sent me the email inviting me to come here, and you were interested in Bambara's engagement with other writers, right? And I mean, I love teaching Black feminist literature. It's one of my favorite classes to teach because they truly are a community, for better and for worse, right? Like, y'all know what it is to be in community, right? Like, it's beautiful, it's enriching, it's complicated, it's infuriating. And we see that those dynamics play out in their work, but we also see those dynamics play out in the interviews they do with one another, in their writings about each other, in their journals, right? In their letters, and that is community. And I think that that's part of the resource and like the literature, right? This is part of the blueprint, right, for what we're all trying to do, is really think about them as a kind of living archive, you know? So thank you for that.
Interlude. Go ahead.
Yes, right?
I had a question about language,
Okay.
because as I was listening to all of the clips that you were playing for us and also your own work, I noticed a kind of free flow between a lot of different things, a lot of different types of language that called in different experiences in my own life. And so I was wondering what your concept is around language. I know we talked a little bit about it before, but kind of bringing how you conceive of knowledge in the pedagogical space, and then how you even use kind of even the rhythm of your words to disrupt the kind of colonial pronunciation of some words, like pedagogical, you know what I'm saying? So how do you break that down while you're teaching, when you're presenting and breaking it down like that?
So, okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of hear 2 different sets of thoughts and ideas there. So as a creative writer, I think often in terms of voice. Okay. Is it 6?
No, sorry.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Okay. I think in terms of voice, right? So like my character's voices, first of all, my fiction is always voice driven, right? And so in terms of sort of the pronunciation, sort of rhythm, flow, right? And that comes very much from my, again, coming up on hip hop and on Stevie, who you were playing earlier today. I was like, okay. But I also think, I mean, you're also kind of talking about sort of what I think of as heteroglossia. Well, me and Mikhail Bakhtin and a whole bunch of other people, right? Heteroglossia, multivocality, and how that's part of an African American and African diaspora literary tradition. Black feminism in the 80s, so Mae Henderson is one person, Dale Smith also they begin to use these sort of terms from Russian formalism, heteroglossia being one, because it's a term that talks about how the kind of invocation of multiple voices can be used as a way to invoke multiple political perspectives, basically. And that's, hugely important to my scholarly work. partly because I think it's important to the folks that I work on, right? And it's important in my creative writing. I think it is a great pedagogical tool as well. Code switching is strategy. It's survival, it's strategy, it's a point, it's a politic, right? And especially, you know, when we think globally and diasporically, invoking multiple languages that African descended people speak and multiple versions of given languages, it highlights the multiplicity of the subjectivities, right, that we're exploring, and it highlights the complexity of the critique, right, from my perspective, of this kind of intersectional critique. So that is to say, yeah, absolutely, right, like language is always political, and I think in more nuanced ways than we tend to give Black women's literature credit for. You know. So thank you for that.
Other questions? I mean, I really. Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Oh, thanks. Hello. Oh, hi. I really enjoyed your piece that you read, and I noticed in it. I really liked especially the parts where you called out, like you mentioned, like it's like the same shit in a different language, and like you're applying like what's bringing some Spanish into that. And I was wondering if you could kind of like elaborate on your thoughts with doing that, and like maybe like this is not what it was about, but like if it is related to like I don't know, like building collaboration between like Black feminists and like Latinx like feminist movements, like if you could speak a little bit to like where you see like the opportunity and like power in doing that.
That's a great question. Yes, that's the short answer, right? Yeah, absolutely. There's a part that I only read maybe like 2/3 of the story. There's a part that I didn't read that is kind of goes in on that, and it's kind of like, wait a minute, but Patricia is actually Black, and what's going on, and how come people don't understand it? So, you know, yeah, and I think that that's for me is a function of, well, having grown up in New York, right, sort of hearing lots of languages, and in a kind of Afrocentric household, 1980s, kente cloth, everything, right? You know, look, I got stories to tell about that. Matching Easter outfits, okay, with like the kufi, all kinds of things. Yeah, it was really the most. But so like, you know, sort of thinking through a diasporic consciousness where the language to articulate it wasn't quite available, right? And then there are all of these other languages, the languages that we do receive that tell us that in fact we are wholly distinct entities and groups of people, that collaboration and solidarity have to be built, right? And they do have to be built, but I think in order to build them, we have to also unbuild the logics that tell us that we're in fact these totally distinct people, right? And that's about internalized oppression on multiple sides. It's about xenophobia, it's about classism, it's about sexism, you know, in multiple ways, homophobia, definitely, right? And so, you know, that is definitely, I think, that's a big part of what I'm thinking through in that story, and what the character is thinking through. It's funny because, like, as from a creative writing standpoint, it does go back to voice for me as well. Like, this was the voice of the character. It appeared to me, or I always struggle with, there's like no term for a sonic apparition. It occurred to me immediately and kind of whole, like fully formed this voice. And so I kind of followed it, but this is where it led me. And it's funny because like that story, you know, some people have read it as having a kind of like post-racial vision, which I think, salud, which I think is like basic in the most basic sense. You know what I mean? Like, you know, like that's not what it is. It's because I think there are more nuanced ways to think about like cross-cultural, you know, collaboration and critique than like colorblindness, you know?
Yeah. I think we can take one or two more. Two more. This side of the room is quiet. If I look at you, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, so I was thinking through your last story and the poetic nature of it, and I was wondering how your experience with hip hop has influenced the lyricism of your work.
Thank you. I love that question. You know, I feel like I didn't have an answer to this question until I started teaching this class, actually. Because like, so this is a long, well, it's gonna be brief, but like, you know, often when we do think about hip hop as a kind of viable literary archive, we think of it in terms of poetry and poetics, right? Hip hop as street poetry. And I absolutely am with that and do that. But trying to think about hip hop in terms of narrative was one of the kind of challenges I wanted to set for myself in this class. And it really helped me to figure out like how hip hop has shaped my work as a fiction writer. And I think that it is absolutely, it's that concept of flow, right? Kind of going back to the earlier question, you know, the cadences of my characters define the shapes of their stories. You know what I mean? Especially in first person stories. And that's the case in hip hop as well. Like literally when you have a flow, it means you have a voice, right? And it means like, it's not just about sort of it's not just about sort of rhythm and meter and rhyme. It's about sort of the fluidity, right? And the kind of consistency or inconsistency of rhythm and meter and rhyme in your storytelling. And that is absolutely something that I strive for. And I think when my fiction is working, that's why, you know? And I think absolutely, I mean, like, hip hop has been as formal or formative for me as, you know, as literary text. Biggie and Toni Morrison, okay? You know what I mean? And then like, you know, and then Missy and Audrey and Tazaki and, you know, Jay-Z, right? So like, it's a melange for sure. But I think that they have actually more in common from a storytelling standpoint in terms of the kind of connection between storytelling and voice. One more.
It looks like maybe a question over there. I don't know. Is this you, Omia? Is this your hand?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is this working?
I don't know.
Wow, it really doesn't sound like it is. My question, I hope this is not too personal of a question, but I just came from AAAS at UC Berkeley, had a conference today. And so I've been thinking about this question a lot of like what it feels like to do the work, the Black feminist work, the work of Black studies. Yeah, both in terms of like what it takes, the ways that it breaks us, but also in terms of like in all the ways. I mean that like in the beautiful but also in the difficult ways.
That's a great question. Who, me? I can repeat. I mean, no, everyone should hear it. So yeah. I'll try to paraphrase. You phrased it very, I think, movingly and elegantly. I think the question is sort of, what does it feel like to do the work of Black feminism, both in terms of its beauty, but also maybe it's sort of what it requires, right? Like what it takes and what it offers, right? And sort of what it feels like. Yeah, I think that that's a beautiful question. You know, there's a moment in the section that I didn't share with you all where I talk about sort of Black feminism as being hard on the body, hard on the heart. And rather, what I'll say is in that moment, I'm talking about teaching Black feminism in predominantly white institutional spaces. Let me clarify, right? And, you know, by extension, sort of living in for me, a fat, Black, queer, feminist body, right? Is hard on the body, hard on the heart, hard on the mind. And I think that, you know, but that has to, I don't know, I'm like really kind of, I keep coming back to space, right? That has to do with the context, whether it's the context of the room, you know, the block, the institution, the country, the globe, right? But like, you know, we always have to imagine other presents, right? Present tenses, right? And we have to imagine other present spaces as well, right? Other sort of heres. And I think that part is just unimaginably generative and healing and nurturing. And for me as a creative writer, that's partly because it's also it's a kind of dialogic process, right? It happens in community. Even if I'm sitting alone at my laptop writing whatever, or with my journal or whatever, knowing that the words will reach other people, right? And knowing what Black feminist literature has done for me and how it has sustained me being able to participate in that in whatever way, I mean, that's like the greatest possible gift, you know? So I think it's definitely a both and. I guess, you know, so it feels, I mean, I think it feels beautiful, right? In the sense that, like, you know, beauty can and often does include pain, but it feels necessary and it feels healing, and energizing. And it gives me hope, you know? Yeah. Thank you for that. That was a good question.
I know we are all like stuffed full, like full with insight and inspiration and knowledge. Thank you so much. One more round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Jakia.
Thank you, y'all.
Do you want final announcements and then breathing? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Since kind of the beautiful collaborative work that was demonstrated with us today and has been demonstrated, I think, throughout the work of the lecturers all quarter, that oftentimes the differences that we see between ourselves as folks of color are the same fish and different sauce. Yeah. And so we'll take a deep breath in, knowing that truth, and out with noise. We're so thankful for being able to imagine new spaces of learning and opportunities to connect with one another. We acknowledge the ways that the institution and the education system harms all of us. And so we're just so thankful for the ways that we can begin to create something new with each other, both all of us as students and all of us as teachers and professors. And so we take a deep breath in with that in truth and knowledge. Deep breath in. And out with noise. I just recognize all the labor that's been happening with this being in this point of the quarter, this point in the year. I want to acknowledge the holy month of Ramadan right now and the folks who have been fasting. I want to acknowledge May 5th as an acknowledgement and awareness of missing and murdered indigenous women, and just the work that we need to continually do and not be neutral, and creating a more safe space for all of us, especially for indigenous and Black women, women of color, trans women. So we take a deep breath in with that truth. And out with noise. And these are hard truths, but they're also truths that we can very much transform, that we are transforming. And a lot of folks are working to make that happen. Y'all are working to make that happen. And a few more deep breaths in. Hold it. Hold it. And out with noise. And finally, one more time, because there's not enough of that. Deep breath in, all the way through your back, your spine, your shoulder blades, your jaw. And out with love and out with noise. We love you. We see you. We see you, Mecca. Professor Sullivan. Thank you so much, Jakia, and all of you. All right, have a beautiful night.